My guest at this time is Jessica Vaughan. She is the Director of Policy Studies at the Center for Immigration Studies. She joins me today to talk about what is and is not in the budget bill that provides border security funding, as well as President Trump's decision to sign the bill, but also declare a national emergency. And Jessica, thanks so much for being with us.
Good talking with you, Greg.
Well, first of all, we've got this funding bill, and obviously most folks don't want the government to shut down again. There had been some on the House Freedom Caucus side who don't like what's in this bill, and they just want to do a week or two at existing spending rates to work out the kinks in this one. So let's start with the legislation before Congress right now. It seems like the more folks look at this, the more those on your side of the immigration debate don't like what they see in terms of the priorities here of who's allowed in the country, who gets protection, and whether we'll actually secure the border. So what jumps out to you from this legislation?
Well, this certainly is not as acceptable as was advertised or previewed as recently as Tuesday. There are a number of concerning provisions. I mean, if this were just about $1.375 billion for the wall and, some, level funding for other things, that would be okay. But what's happening here is yes, the president gets extra money for the wall, 55 miles of barrier in South Texas, which has been the ground zero for most illegal entries lately. But it also has a local veto of those plans. It has a provision that says that local government officials there have to sign off on what the government wants to do with respect to fencing there, and that is a potential obstruction to what the government wants to do. And all the federal land is exempt also from having a barrier. So that's a problem. But the bigger problem is that ICE and Interior Enforcement basically are paying for the wall. And what that means is that there's funding for border protection and Customs and Border Protection staff, but there is no funding for enforcement in the interior, and in fact some provisions that make it likely that this influx of families and kids from not only Central America but other parts of the world as well are likely to continue, because what this bill does provide more funding for is more shelters, more services, and more catch and release for people who are caught trying to get over the southern border who want to get caught. And it has some restrictions on what ICE can do. For example, you and your listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with the unaccompanied minors who've been coming across, basically kids coming across, their parents pay a smuggler. Their sponsors, most of whom are in the country illegally, would be immune from enforcement. And so, I would say if people haven't brought a child over with a smuggler yet, this is certainly an encouragement to keep doing that. And there's very little in this that would help the government stop what is happening at the border. So it's really just going to make things worse, I think, by sending that message. And that's a big problem. There are some other things. It increases guest workers, and there are some other provisions that people have a problem with. But the basic punchline is that this is not going to help the crisis at the border. It's going to make it worse, all in exchange for a little bit of barriers that probably can be tied up in court for a long time.
What would have made this bill acceptable to you? What provisions needed to be in? And I'm guessing the ones that we just discussed are probably the ones that would need to be out, at least most of them. What would have been a good bill from your perspective?
I think it would have, the amount of money, $1.375 billion, it was not as much as we need for border barriers, but that would have been a good down payment. If that had come without this local veto authority, it would have been fine. Even if it didn't, if the president were not allowed to do his, the new styles of wall that he was looking at doing, even if it had to be the old style, that would have been fine. I do think it's a problem to not address this influx of kids and families and actually to make it easier for them. It would have been better to use that money for ICE to be able to go after the ones who have become a problem here, like those who came in that influx, for example, who are involved with criminal street gangs like MS-13, and those parents who brought their kids who also are priority deportation targets for, because of problems that they've caused here. All of those would have been fine. More money for ICE detention so that it can keep custody of criminal aliens, that especially the ones that get released in sanctuary jurisdictions. All of that is really not controversial to most people. But to cut ICE's ability to do that kind of enforcement is really a step in the wrong direction.
We're talking with Jessica Vaughan, Director of Policy Studies at the Center for Immigration Studies. And Jessica, the president says he will sign this. Based on what we can tell, it's going to be passed in the House and the Senate. He's also going to declare a national emergency, which has been the subject of a great amount of debate. Some believe that the border situation certainly is worthy of a national emergency declaration. Others believe it's simply politics. And even those who think he's probably right believe that it's a questionable precedent, because then other administrations with different priorities could circumvent Congress on issues from guns to the environment to any number of issues. So what do you make of his decision to do this?
Well, again, depending on what he announces, I think it's likely that this is going to be a very limited set of actions that he takes in order to free up some resources to help with the border crisis. I don't think we're going to see, martial law in the border zone or any of the things that some of the Democrats have suggested would happen. I think it's going to be a targeted, limited reprogramming of funding that he couldn't get in other ways. And utilizing the Department of Defense to help with border security in states and maybe other law enforcement agencies, just to get more resources down there to try to address this problem, to try to send the message that people have to, we're not going to tolerate this continued influx of people. And if that's the best he can do, I think that he should do it. It's almost like he's saying, I kind of have a gun to my head with the specter of a shutdown. I've got to sign this to prevent a shutdown, but I'm doing whatever I can to mitigate it.
This funding takes us to the end of the fiscal year, which is the end of September. That takes us to another funding debate sometime either later this year or maybe even early next year, depending on if things play out like they did in the last fiscal year. So where does this agreement place the debate once this funding runs out, do you think?
Well, you're right. Congress is going to have to go through the same exercise again in just a few short months, and I don't expect that it will be any easier then. I do think that this, when you consider how tough this fight was over a relatively small piece of the larger immigration issue, we're not even talking about E-Verify or amnesty for people with DACA. This shows me how difficult it would be to resolve any of those larger questions, and that, if Congress has so much trouble with this, we might as well forget all the other bigger issues, and we're looking at status quo for quite a long time.
Jessica, we'll call time there. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Jessica Vaughan is Director of Policy Studies at the Center for Immigration Studies. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.